imagine finding out that the person that you spent 7 years with is gay.
They ruled the world with their voices. Yet when the lights went out, they believed they were going home to something unshakable. Devoted husbands and stable lives waiting behind the spotlight. They built families, marked life's biggest moments together, and trusted the men closest to them without question. Yet behind closed doors, another reality was being carefully hidden, one that remained buried for years, sometimes decades. Then came the truth: secret relationships, hidden affairs, and the shocking realization that the men they had loved had been living double lives, secretly involved with other men while concealing their true sexuality. These are the 14 black singers who caught their husbands having gay affairs. Number 14, Melba Moore. A Tony Award winner with millions in the bank ended up on public assistance because she trusted the man who managed her money and shared her bed. Melba Moore had one of the most thrilling voices of her era. A Tony-winning Broadway star and R&B powerhouse whose career lit up the 70s and 80s. In 1974, she married Charles Huggins, a music executive who became both her husband and the manager of nearly every part of her career. He handled the contracts, the bookings, the finances, and the strategy. To Melba, it all felt like protection, the steady hand of a man who loved her enough to guard her from a brutal industry. She let him run everything. That trust held for 17 years. The unraveling started at the edges. The money she should have been earning stopped showing up. Contracts that once paid her well went quiet. By the early 1990s, she discovered the truth in layers, each one worse than the last. Huggins had been carrying on relationships with men while using their marriage as cover, and he had drained her fortune to fund the life he was hiding. She accused him in court of treating her like a personal bank, living off her fame and her earnings while loving someone else entirely. She had earned an estimated $30 million across her career. By the end of the divorce, she had lost her home, her savings, and the rights to much of her own catalog. And at one point, she was relying on welfare to feed herself and her daughter. Huggins fought back with a defamation countersuit, but the court protected her words as honest opinion in a contentious divorce. The voice was still hers, the fortune was gone, and the woman who had once played to packed Broadway theaters had to climb out of nothing all over again, which she did. Number 13, Jevetta Steele. Two Queens, One Castle was the title of the musical Jevetta wrote. One castle was the marriage, one queen was her. The other queen was the man her husband had been sleeping with behind her back. She wrote the whole thing about her own life, and the title alone tells you how much rage and clarity she had earned by the time she sat down to write it. Most people know her voice without knowing her name. Jevetta Steele sang Calling You, the aching ballad from the 1987 film Baghdad Cafe, a song nominated for an Academy Award and built on one of the most heartbreaking vocal performances of its decade. She comes from the Steeles of Minneapolis, one of the most respected families in gospel, a clan raised on harmony and faith. So when she married Armando Dickerson, she was building the kind of home she had been raised to value. A musician husband, a first baby on the way, a family that looked, from the outside, like everything she came from. She was 8 months pregnant when it collapsed in a single conversation. Her husband was gay. He had been seeing men the entire time, and the part underneath that part was worse. He was HIV positive. The year was the late 80s going into the 90s, when an HIV diagnosis carried the weight of a death sentence and a public shaming all at once. Jevetta was weeks from delivery, nursery already painted, and she had to swallow the possibility that her husband had given the virus to her, that the baby inside her had been exposed, and that the marriage she trusted had been a slow attempt on her life he had never warned her about. The shock nearly sent her into early labor. The miracle is that both of them came through clean. She tested negative. The baby was born healthy. Most people would stop the story there. Jevetta picked up a pen. She wrote Two Queens, One Castle, so other women could see what had almost happened to her, in their own marriages, in their own beds, with their own husbands still smiling at them at breakfast. She put it on a stage. She made strangers watch. She named the silence that had nearly cost her life and put it under theater lights so the next woman might recognize the warning in time. Number 12. Tamar Braxton. She married a man with all the right credentials and was out of the marriage in 2 years. She did not tell the world why for almost 2 decades, and even then, she let the fans put the pieces together themselves. Tamar Braxton is a powerhouse R&B voice and a magnetic reality television presence, the youngest of the famous Braxton sisters, with a personality big enough to fill any room she walks into. In 2001, with her career finding its footing, she married music producer Daryl Allenby, a man whose resume made him look like the perfect match for a singer on the rise. The industry read it as a smart, professional pairing, a developing artist backed by an experienced producer. The first months were busy with work and silence. The silence was the warning. Long pauses where conversation should have been. A husband whose distance she could feel but could not name. By 2003, they were divorced, with no public reason given, leaving fans to guess. Tamar moved on. From 2008 to 2017, she was married to producer Vincent Herbert in a much more public 9-year union that played out across reality television. The real story of her first marriage stayed sealed the entire time. Years later, she finally cracked the door open with a now famous line, saying that if a man doesn't touch you in 3, 4, or 10 days, then he's gay. The internet ran with it. She quickly clarified she was not talking about Vince, then added that she had been married once before Vince when she was very young. Fans connected the dots. The first husband, the 2-year marriage that ended without explanation in 2003. The silence that finally had a name. Number 11. Tisha Campbell. 20 years of marriage came undone, and the secret that ended it had been visible in the gossip columns the whole time. Tisha Campbell is the magnetic actress and singer at the heart of the 1990s sitcom Martin, beloved for her sharp comic timing, her huge voice, and her bright energy on screen. In 1996, she married fellow actor Dwayne Martin, and the two of them became one of Hollywood's most admired black couples. Through the late 90s and the entire 2000s, they were one of the rare stable marriages in entertainment, raising 2 sons, attending events together, and protecting their image so carefully that almost no one questioned it publicly. In a town that eats its couples for breakfast, they had survived. The cracks were old. Starting in the early 2000s, Dwayne began turning up in unusually close friendships with several A-list male stars, including one of the most famous black actors alive, and the whispers traveled fast inside the industry. The talk stayed in the gray zone for years, dismissed as the usual Hollywood static. Then, in 2018, Tisha filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Reports tied Dwayne to allegations of secret same-sex relationships, and his bisexuality became one of the worst-kept secrets in entertainment, even as he publicly denied it. Then, in late 2023, a former personal assistant of Will Smith made a claim in an interview that he walked in on Smith and Martin engaging in physical intimacy. For Tisha, the math was brutal. She had given more than 2 decades to a marriage built on something she had never been told the truth about. She left the marriage anyway, kept raising her sons, kept performing, and started speaking carefully about valuing her own peace. Number 10. Phyllis Hyman. She sang sadness more beautifully than anyone alive, and the man she went home to was the reason. Phyllis Hyman was tall, stunning, and carried a deep contralto voice that quieted entire rooms. A legend of 70s and 80s soul and jazz with hits like You Know How to Love Me and Living All Alone. Beneath the elegance, she fought a lifelong battle with bipolar disorder and severe depression, demons her audiences could hear in every note but rarely understood. In 1977, she married Larry Alexander, who took on the dual role of husband and personal manager. At first, he looked like exactly the anchor she needed, the steady hand arranging her career while she poured her ache into songs that gutted listeners. The anchor turned into a weight. Larry began using work as the reason he was rarely home. and the truth underneath that excuse cut deeper than any ordinary affair. In 1985, she discovered why he kept disappearing. He had a second home with another man. The marriage ended in 1988, but the wound stayed open. She kept performing, kept moving audiences, kept pouring more real grief into every note. For years she carried bipolar disorder and depression in silence, and it was only getting worse. She never stopped. When she was found dead in 1995, she was due back on stage at the Apollo Theater just hours later. And Number 9. Terry McMillan. She wrote the love story that defined a generation, and the man it was based on was lying the entire time. How Stella got her groove back, sold millions of copies, and convinced women everywhere that a great romance could still arrive late and arrive perfect. The author behind it, Terry McMillan, was already one of the biggest names in American fiction thanks to Waiting to Exhale, and the Stella novel grew straight out of her own life. She had met a young Jamaican man named Jonathan Plummer at a resort during a 1995 vacation, fallen hard for him despite a 23-year age gap, and built a bestseller out of the feeling. In 1998, she married him for real. For more than 6 years, she believed she was living the very fantasy she had sold to her readers. Then in 2004, he sat her down and said the thing that unmade everything. He told her he was gay. He had always been gay. He was leaving her for a man. The muse who had inspired the most romantic novel in modern black literature had been carrying a secret bigger than the whole book. She filed for divorce immediately and accused him in court of using their marriage to get a green card and American citizenship. He fired back, asking for millions in spousal support. The fight turned into national entertainment when both of them sat across from Oprah Winfrey in front of millions of viewers, where McMillan broke down, describing a marriage she said had been a performance from day one. The court awarded him only about $50,000, a humiliating sliver of what he had demanded. The woman who taught a generation how to dream about love kept writing. The novel about him stayed on shelves. She had sold a fantasy she did not get to keep, and she gave it to her readers anyway. Number 8. Star Jones. The wedding had 8 bridesmaids, 2 custom Reem Acra gowns, and so many corporate sponsors that the bride was attacked on her own television show for turning her marriage into a commercial. Star Jones was a former prosecutor who had become one of the sharpest voices on The View, a daytime juggernaut where she shared the panel with Barbara Walters. In 2004, in front of millions of envious viewers, she married Al Reynolds in a ceremony so extravagant that the press called her a bridezilla and refused to let go of the nickname. The gossip about the groom started before the rice did. Around the entertainment world, Reynolds had picked up a cruel nickname behind his back, the kind of nickname that suggests everyone in the room knows something the bride does not. Star heard every word of it and refused to flinch. She defended her husband with the same intensity she once used to convict criminals. The marriage lasted 4 years. They divorced in 2008, and the timing of her exit lined up suspiciously with her firing from The View, a 1-2 punch that took her from television royalty to public punchline. To most observers, the breakup felt inevitable, the natural ending of a marriage that the audience had questioned from day one. But the real reveal took almost another decade to surface. In 2017, Al Reynolds finally spoke for himself and came out as bisexual. He described growing up in a strict Southern Baptist environment in the conservative South, a community where being anything other than straight meant being cast out. He said the fear of that judgment had pushed him to bury his real self for years, and that the marriage to one of the most powerful women on daytime television had been part of the burial. Star Jones, sharp enough to dismantle a hostile witness, had been blindsided in her own bedroom. Number 7. Tichina Arnold. She married a basketball coach, hoping for stability, and 3 years later she found a hard drive that ended everything. Tichina Arnold is the actress who played Pamela on Martin, half of one of the most iconic friendships in 90s television alongside Tisha Campbell, a woman known on screen and off for being sharp, funny, and impossible to fool. After her first marriage to boxer Layman Brewster ended, She started over in 2012 by marrying basketball coach Rico Hines. Friends were relieved. He seemed grounded, athletic, and stable, the opposite of the chaos that often comes with marrying an entertainer. 3 years into the marriage, something about his behavior stopped fitting together, and she went looking for the answer. What she found was multiple videos, recordings of her husband being intimate with other people, and among those recordings, some believe were also a few encounters with men. She did not retreat into private grief. She did something almost no betrayed wife in entertainment ever does. Within a month, she filed for divorce, and she deliberately showed the evidence to her closest family and friends before the gossip machine could get hold of it and twist the story. In Hollywood, the wife is often the first one blamed when a marriage falls apart, and Ticina refused to let her name be smeared in advance. Her decision protected her dignity, her child, and her sanity all at once. Number 6. Porsha Williams. A multi-million-dollar mansion, an NFL quarterback for a husband, and a wife who quietly admitted she felt alone the whole time. Porsha Williams burst onto the Real Housewives of Atlanta as one of its most magnetic personalities, the granddaughter of civil rights icon Hosea Williams, and a woman who knew how to hold a camera's attention. In 2011, she married Cordell Stewart, a former NFL quarterback whose hyper-masculine athlete image had made him a star in Pittsburgh and beyond. On paper, they looked like the perfect collision of beauty and brawn. The mansion, the matching cars, the press appearances, all of it photographed beautifully. What the photographs didn't show was the silence inside the house. Cordell carried a long shadow. Rumors about his sexuality had circulated in NFL circles since the late 1990s, including reports of him being seen with men in compromising situations, and while the gossip was crushed publicly during his playing days, it never disappeared. Porsha knew almost none of that history when she said yes. Inside the marriage, she lived next to a man who, by her own later account on television, showed no interest in physical intimacy with her, who seemed cold and distant in ways she could not explain. In 2013, Cordell filed for divorce abruptly, blindsiding her with how fast it moved. As the breakup played out on reality TV, she began naming what she had been swallowing in silence. She talked about a husband who would not touch her and who behaved in ways around men that she found revealing. Cordell hit back, insisted he was fully straight, and pursued legal action against people he said had defamed him. Number 5. Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge was the most beautiful star Hollywood almost did not let exist. She became the first black woman ever nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress, the lead in Carmen Jones, the woman whose face was on magazine covers across America. Even as the industry refused to give her the roles a white actress of her caliber would have been buried under. In 1942, she married Harold Nicholas, one half of the legendary Nicholas brothers, the dance duo whose superhuman footwork had electrified Broadway and Hollywood. He was charming and beautiful and considered one of the most desirable men in show business. The young couple looked like a movie poster come to life. The poster was a lie. Harold lived a wild life of all-night parties, long disappearances, and persistent rumors of private all-male gatherings the public barely knew existed. Then in 1943, their daughter Harolyn was born with severe brain damage and would never speak, never recognize her mother, never live independently. Dorothy poured herself into caring for a child who would need her completely for life, while Harold drifted further from home. By day, she fought through an industry thick with racial prejudice, climbing toward the history-making roles that would define her legacy. By night, she came home to a child who needed everything, and a husband who was almost never there. The marriage ended in 1951. The career that should have followed her Oscar nomination never materialized because Hollywood would not cast a black leading lady in the part she deserved. In 1965, at only 42 years old, Dorothy Dandridge was found dead in her apartment, with a few dollars left in her bank account. Number 4. Ernestine Campbell. She was a quiet secretary from Washington who married the wildest man in rock and roll during the 1 year he was trying to be a preacher. Ernestine Campbell met Richard Penniman in 1959, the man the world knew and screamed for as Little Richard, the architect of rock and roll, the human firework behind Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Good Golly Miss Molly. But she did not meet him on a stage. She met him in a church. 2 years earlier, at the peak of his fame, Little Richard had stunned everyone by walking away from secular music after a spiritual crisis on a plane he believed was going down. He declared he would give the rest of his life to God and become a preacher. And he was deep into that promise when Ernestine crossed his path. 6 months after meeting, they were married. The world watched and wondered if the most flamboyant performer in music had really left it all behind. He had not. Richard was a man split clean in half, one side straining to be the holy preacher he had vowed to become, the other side aching for the screaming crowds and the blaze of the lights. By the early 1960s, the stage won. He drifted back into secular music, and the marriage cracked under the pressure of touring, fame, and an artist who could never sit still. They divorced in 1964. Ernestine spent nearly 2 decades after that believing the marriage had simply been a normal one wrecked by show business. Then Richard told the world the rest. In a 1982 interview, he stated plainly that he had been gay his whole life, and in later years he described himself as omnisexual, a man whose desires ran far stranger and freer than the public ever guessed. Number 3. Louise Thompson Patterson. Their wedding was the marriage of the year, and the bride was on a train heading away from her husband within 6 months. Louise Thompson was an intellectual force at the center of the Harlem Renaissance, an organizer whose salons gathered the era's greatest black writers, artists, and thinkers in her living room to argue and dream. In 1928, she married Wallace Thurman, the rising young writer whose novel The Blacker the Berry had stirred fierce debate and made his name one of the most discussed in black literature. 2 sharp minds joining forces, both deep inside the same cultural movement. People expected a literary power couple. They got something else entirely. The marriage soured almost instantly. Thurman lived in a tight knot of tension, guarding his private life so carefully that the distance between him and his new wife grew impossible to ignore. The truth was that he had romantic feelings toward men, and in the late 1920s, even inside the relatively bohemian Harlem Renaissance, admitting that openly was nearly impossible for a writer trying to protect his standing. Marriage to a respected, intelligent woman with status in intellectual circles offered him perfect cover. The cover lasted about 6 months. Louise saw it clearly and walked away rather than become a screen for someone else's secret. Thurman denied the rumors for the rest of his short life, drank himself toward an early death, and was gone by 1934 at 32. Louise poured her formidable mind into politics instead, becoming one of the most important radical organizers of her generation, a leader in the fight for civil rights and women's rights who lived into her 90s. The marriage was a footnote in her story. The activism became her legacy. Number 2. Lynette McKee. She walked away from the marriage in 1990 thinking she had simply outgrown a husband who had stopped fitting her life. Then he died, and what came out afterward changed the way she would think about her own survival for the rest of her life. Lynette McKee was already a quiet force in American film. She had been the breakout star of Sparkle, the dramatic spine of the Cotton Club, and she went on to anchor 2 of Spike Lee's biggest pictures, Jungle Fever and Malcolm X. She refused to play one note, and directors loved her for it. In 1983, she made a choice that surprised people. She did not marry another actor. She married Leo Compton, a youth counselor treated in his community like the kind of man other men were supposed to imitate. For 7 years, their home looked like a rare entertainment marriage that worked. The divorce in 1990 came quietly, with no scandal and no headlines, and most people read it as 2 adults moving in different directions. Then Compton got sick. Not long after the split, he died from complications of AIDS, and the silence around the marriage cracked open. He had loved both men and women, and the respectable counselor had been living a second life the whole time he was living the first one. For Lynette, the grief was tangled with something colder. She had been intimate with a man carrying the virus during the worst years of the epidemic. Number 1. LaJoyce Brookshire. She built her entire career telling women how to choose a good husband, and she buried hers without knowing he had given her the deadliest secret of her life. LaJoyce Brookshire is an author, educator, and speaker who built her reputation inspiring others about marriage, family, and faith. A strong woman who used her own home life as the centerpiece of her message. In the late 1980s, she married a man everyone described as reliable, mature, and calm, and for years she stood in front of audiences and lifted up her marriage as proof of what she preached. The early years passed peacefully. They built a home, made plans, attended church, and her husband gave off no sign at all that anything was wrong. The secret was buried so well that the woman sharing his bed never suspected a thing. By the mid-1990s, his health began to slip. LaJoyce, believing it was an ordinary illness, cared for him with a devoted wife's love until he died in 1995. The grief had barely settled when she started looking into what had actually killed him, and the floor opened underneath her entire life. He had died of complications from AIDS. As she dug through what she could find, the hidden truth surfaced piece by piece. The husband she had trusted completely had carried on a secret gay sex life, and most chilling of all, he had known he was HIV positive before he ever walked her down the aisle. He had stood at the altar, slept beside her every night, and never said a word, all to protect a moral image that was a lie. Tests showed LaJoyce had somehow escaped infection. Instead of staying silent, she carried the entire horror into the open, writing books, giving speeches, and turning her own near-death into a warning loud enough that other women might hear it in time. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.